The baptismal room smells like clean water and old wood and something sacred that you cannot name. White robes hang from the hooks on the wall like patient witnesses. Folded towels are stacked in careful rows on the shelf below the window. The pool itself sits quiet and full, the surface still, catching the overhead light in a way that makes it look almost luminous. I had been in that room 100 times, setting up for baptisms, checking the robe sizes, counting the towels. I knew every corner of it the way you know the rooms in your own house. I was not looking for anything unusual. I was simply doing what I always did. But there it was, on the narrow wooden ledge that runs along the right wall, just below the hook where the men's robes hang. A ring, a gold band, thick, heavy-looking even from a foot away. I picked it up and turned it over in my palm, and that's when I saw the engraving on the inside. 3 initials, a dash, and a date. And I felt something shift in the room the way air shifts before a storm. I didn't know what that ring meant when I picked it up. I only knew it did not belong to any man being baptized that morning. I didn't know I'd see that ring again. On someone's hand. Stay with me, because what happened at the baptism wasn't an accident. It was exposure. My name is Gloria Mae Thornton. I am 61 years old. I am a retired school district administrator, a grandmother to 2, and for the last 23 years, I have been a member of New Covenant Fellowship Baptist Church in a mid-sized city in the Mid-South. I serve as the head of the Baptism Preparation Ministry, which is a formal way of saying that I am the woman who makes sure the robes are pressed, the pool is clean, the towels are stacked, and the candidates for baptism have everything they need before they step into that water. I want you to understand what that role means to me, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand it. Baptism is not a production. It is not a spectacle. It is one of the most intimate, most irreversible moments in a person's spiritual life. The moment when they put on Christ publicly and step out of something old and into something they have chosen to become. I take that seriously. I have been taking it seriously for over 2 decades. The baptism preparation ministry was my calling inside my calling, and I guarded it accordingly. The Sunday in question was the 3rd Sunday in April. We had 11 candidates for baptism that morning, a larger than usual number, the result of a 6-week discipleship series that the pastor had led through the winter. One of those 11 candidates was my niece, Imani. Imani is 27 years old, my late sister's daughter. She came to live with me when she was 14, after her mother passed, and she has been like my own child in every way that matters. Watching her make this decision, to be baptized, to publicly declare her faith after a season of real searching and real struggle, was one of the great joys of my life. I had been emotional about it for weeks. I had been praying over it, pressing her baptism robe 3 times, the way you do when something matters enough to get right. I arrived at the church at 6 o'clock that morning, an hour and a half before the first service. I went directly to the baptism room off the East Corridor. I always do a full setup check the morning of, alone, before anyone else arrives. It is my ritual. I check the water temperature, the robe rack, the towel count, the bench where candidates sit before they go in. Everything was in order. And then I saw the ring. It was on the narrow wooden ledge below the men's robe hooks. Not hidden, not dropped and rolled somewhere you'd have to search for it. Placed. The way something is placed when someone sets it down deliberately, but was interrupted before they could return for it. A thick gold band, not costume jewelry, not something cheap. The kind of ring that has weight. I picked it up. The engraving was on the inside of the band, and whoever had it done had paid for real work. The letters were clean and deep. R.E.C., and then a dash, and then a date. June 12th, 2009. R.E.C., June 12th, 2009. I stood there in the quiet of that room with the pool reflecting light around me, and I looked at that ring for a long moment. It was clearly a wedding band. The engraving was the kind you put on the inside of a ring when you want to mark the day you made a vow. I turned it over in my fingers. There was no oxidation, no wear pattern on the outside that would suggest it had been removed for any length of time. This was a ring someone had been wearing recently and had set on that ledge in a hurry. I didn't know whose initials those were. I thought through the men in our congregation, REC, and nothing surfaced immediately. I put the ring in the small pocket of my apron. I wear a white apron over my clothes when I'm setting up. And I went back to my work. I would put it in the lost and found box in the church office after service, I decided. Someone would come looking for it. I had no idea what I was holding. Let me tell you about the man who was the center of this story, because you need to know him before you can understand the weight of what came later. Minister Raymond Elias Caldwell, and I want you to hold those initials in your mind, was the music minister at New Covenant Fellowship. He had been with us for 3.5 years. He came to us with an impressive history, trained at a music conservatory, had directed choirs at 2 congregations in other states before relocating to our city, came with strong recommendations from both former churches, a warm smile, and a testimony about returning to faith after a season of wandering that had moved our congregation deeply the Sunday he shared it. He was 44 years old, well-dressed in that understated way that suggests taste rather than performance, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that some people read as humility and others, if they are paying attention, might read as careful management. I want to be fair to the man I thought I knew. He led our choir with genuine skill. He worked hard. He was present at every rehearsal, every service, every special program. He also served as a deacon in training, which meant he had access to most areas of the church building, including the baptism preparation room. About 8 months before that April Sunday, Minister Raymond had announced his engagement to Sister Portia James, a woman in our congregation who was a middle school science teacher and one of the most earnest, most quietly faithful people I have ever known. The engagement had been announced on a Sunday morning during the closing announcements, and the congregation had cheered. Portia was beloved. Everyone was happy for her. Raymond stood up next to her, and she was glowing the way a woman glows when she believes her life is going exactly where God intended it to go. I had been happy for Portia. I want to state that clearly because I had no suspicion, not one, about Raymond in those days. He had simply been our music minister, competent and present, and Portia had found someone, and that was a good thing. Their wedding was planned for September, 5 months away. Now, there is one thing that should have made me pause, but didn't, because I was not yet asking the right questions. About 2 months before that April baptism Sunday, Sister Portia had come to me quietly after a Wednesday night Bible study. She was not an alarmist. She did not deal in rumors. She was the kind of woman who turned things over for a long time before she brought them to someone else. So when she sought me out specifically, I gave her my full attention. She said she needed to ask me something strange. She said that Raymond had told her his parents were both deceased, both of them before he moved to our city, but that she had recently received a birthday card in the mail addressed to Raymond at her address, signed, "Love, Mom." She had asked him about it, and he had said it was an old friend of his late mother's who had always called herself that, a woman who had raised him for a period in childhood, and that it was not something she needed to worry about. Portia looked at me and said, "Sister Gloria, does that explanation sit right with you?" I told her that explanations sometimes don't sit right, not because they're wrong, but because we're nervous before a big change. I told her to bring it to the Lord and bring it to Raymond again, plainly, if it continued to bother her. That was my answer. I think about it now, and I want to go back and sit with that earlier version of myself and say, push harder. Ask the next question. But I didn't know yet what I didn't know. The second thing I should have held on to happened just 2 Sundays before the April baptism. It was small, the kind of small that only becomes significant in retrospect. I was in the East Corridor on my way to the baptism room for a pre-season check, and Raymond came out of that room. He was not robed. He was in his regular clothes. He saw me, and there was the briefest pause, half a second, maybe less, before he smiled and said he'd been checking that the sound feed worked in there for the live stream. We had been adding cameras to more areas of the church for our online broadcast, so it was a reasonable explanation. I nodded and walked past him. Half a second. A ring on a ledge. I would come to understand that the Holy Spirit speaks in exactly those quantities, and our job is to slow down enough to hear. Now I need to tell you what happened earlier that same morning, because this is where the peace I had set aside began to fit with everything else. Around 6:20, while I was still doing my setup check, Deacon Morris, one of our older deacons who handled building maintenance, stopped in the baptism room doorway to let me know that music minister Raymond had arrived very early, around 5:40, to help verify that the sound speakers in the East Corridor were working properly before the choir rehearsal. There had been a technical issue the week before. Deacon Morris had left Raymond with the key to the technical corridor right next to the baptism room, and Raymond had returned the key 15 minutes later and gone to rehearsal. I nodded and didn't think more about it at the time. But now, with the ring in my pocket and the room arranged with everything in perfect order except that gold band on the ledge, I understood. Raymond had been in that room before me that morning. Not for long. Just long enough to remove the ring, which he did every week before entering the church, and set it on the ledge while he checked something in the technical corridor right next door, and he was interrupted by Deacon Morris before he could come back and retrieve it. That is what I believe happened. He did not have a habit of leaving the ring in that room. It was a 3-minute oversight that had been building for 3.5 years. The morning of the baptism moved the way those mornings always move, with a particular kind of holy busyness that I love. Candidates arriving, some nervous, some radiantly calm. Families gathering in the sanctuary. The choir warming up in the fellowship hall, their voices drifting through the building in fragments of melody that sounded like preparation itself. Imani arrived at 7:45. She was wearing white under her coat, the way I had asked her to. Her eyes were bright and a little wet, and she hugged me in the corridor so hard that I had to steady myself. I held her and I said, "Baby, the Lord has been waiting on this morning for you. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." She laughed and pressed her face against my shoulder, and I will tell you that whatever came later that morning, that moment was untouched by any of it. It was pure and it was real, and it belonged only to her. The ring was still in my apron pocket. The service began at 9. Pastor opened with Psalm 51. "Create in me a clean heart, O God." And the congregation received it the way a congregation receives scripture that already knows them, nodding and humming and settling in. The choir sang, "Take Me to the Water," which they always sing before the baptism portion of the service, and the sound of it in that sanctuary, the harmonies building and the congregation joining on the chorus, was the kind of music that reaches past your ears and touches something behind your sternum. I was in and out of the sanctuary during the first portion of service, moving between the baptism room and the rear doors to coordinate the candidates coming in. Minister Raymond was at the keyboard, leading the choir with his back to the congregation, the way musicians do. I passed behind him twice. I did not think of the ring. I was working. But around 10:25, something different happened. In that moment between the 7th and 8th candidate, when the congregation had settled into a quiet worship vamp and the musicians were slightly relaxed, Raymond turned slightly to speak to the guitarist beside him. And in that turn, that casual repositioning, he looked out across the sanctuary and his eyes swept the back of the corridor, where I was standing. He looked at me for exactly 1 second. Then his gaze dropped, briefly, involuntarily, to the pocket of my apron, not to my face, to the pocket. Then he turned back to the keyboard. It was so quick that anyone not watching would have missed it entirely. But I was watching. And the moment his eyes touched that pocket, I understood 2 facts at the same time. He had realized the ring was missing, and he was quietly trying to determine whether someone had found it. I put my hand in my pocket. I closed my fingers around the band. And then, because I needed to be certain, because a 61-year-old woman who spent decades in school administration does not act on a single glance, I waited. I watched his left hand for the remainder of the service. He was not wearing a ring. REC June 12, 2009. Raymond Elias Caldwell. I want to describe what happened in my body in that moment, because it is important. It was not panic. It was not a dramatic rush of revelation. It was more like the moment when your eyes adjust in a dark room. a slow sharpening, a slow coming into focus of something that was always there, waiting for you to be able to see it. The initials, the date, the ring on the ledge below the men's robes, his access to that room, the half-second in the corridor 2 weeks ago, the glance that had just swept directly to my apron pocket. I stood in the doorway of the baptism room, and I looked across the sanctuary at Raymond Elias Caldwell, who was playing the keyboard at the front of that holy space, and I understood that what I was holding in my pocket was a wedding band that had been worn recently and removed deliberately and left in a room that he had access to, and almost no one else did. And the woman he was engaged to marry in 5 months was in this building, celebrating her niece's baptism. I put the ring back in my pocket. I kept my face still, and I went back to my work because there were 3 more candidates who needed to be received into the water, and I was not going to let the truth I had just begun to understand interrupt the holiness of what they were doing. But my mind was moving, and it was not moving slowly. Imani's baptism was the 9th of the morning. She walked into that water with the particular grace of a person who has made a decision from a deep and settled place. And when Pastor spoke the words over her, and she went under and came back up, the sound that came out of the congregation, not planned, not prompted, just spontaneous and real, was the sound of a community receiving one of their own. She cried. I cried from the doorway, quietly, while still doing my job. After the final candidate came out of the water and the baptism portion of service closed, the congregation moved into the morning sermon. I handed off the baptism room responsibilities to my assistant, a faithful young woman named Sister Brenda, and I went to find Mother Celestine Price. Mother Celestine Price is 83 years old. She has been a member of New Covenant Fellowship since the church was founded. She was a librarian for 40 years, and she has the librarian's gift, which is the gift of remembering things that other people let slide past them. She sat in the 4th pew from the front on the right side of the sanctuary every Sunday of her life, in the same seat, with her Bible open on her lap and her hat pins done correctly and her eyes missing nothing. But what few people knew, what I knew because Mother Celestine had told me one Saturday afternoon during the months we had grown close, was that her husband, Deacon Samuel Price, had passed on June 12, 1987. 42 years of marriage. He had gone to sleep and not woken up that June 12th, and Mother Celestine had said that ever since, that date lived inside her like a second breath, present in everything she read, everything she signed, any document in which that combination of numbers appeared. That was why I was going to find her. I sat down next to her in the pew during the sermon in a way that I hoped looked casual. She glanced at me. She knew it was not casual. I leaned in close and said, very quietly, Mother Celestine, when Minister Raymond joined this congregation, do you remember when we filed his transfer documents? She said, without having to think about it. 3.5 years ago. He came from a church in Tennessee. Clarksville, I believe. Sister Tamara and I did the filing that week. I said, the letter of recommendation from his congregation. Do you remember the date on it? She went very still. Then she said, with a voice that had lost whatever casualness remained, June 12th. I said, of 2009? She nodded, slowly. What made me notice was the day. I always notice June 12th on any paper that passes through my hands. The letter said he had joined that congregation in Clarksville on June 12th, 2009. I filed it and thought, Samuel, and I moved on. She paused. Why are you asking me this now? I reached into my apron pocket. I passed the ring to her palm to palm, under the shelter of her Bible, the way women in church have always passed things to each other when they don't want to be seen. She took it. She looked at it. She looked at the engraving. Her hand went very still. She said, barely above a whisper, R.E.C. Raymond Elias Caldwell, I said. She closed her fingers around the ring. A wedding band, with the date he joined that congregation. She paused. Or the date he made an entirely different vow. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Mother Celestine said very quietly, Child, You know what you need to do. And you know you need to do it before that man stands at an altar with Portia James. I did know. I was just trying to make certain I had enough before I moved, because you only get one chance to set a thing like this in motion, and you do not want to move before you are sure. I did not act impulsively. I want you to know that because some people, when they hear a story like this one, assume that the woman who saw through it must have been reckless, must have been driven by something personal, must have had a motive beyond what she says. I had no motive beyond the truth and the protection of a woman I cared for. I moved carefully. I moved the way you move when you know the ground is uncertain and falling could hurt, not just you, but someone who is trusting you to keep your footing. That same afternoon, I called Portia, not to tell her everything, not yet, but to ask her something specific. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she had ever seen Raymond wearing a ring before she knew him, or whether he had ever mentioned a ring he kept for personal reasons. She went quiet. Then she said yes. She said she had seen a ring on his left hand twice in their early courtship. Once at a dinner, once on a Saturday when he came to her home early and perhaps hadn't had time to take it off. She had asked him about it both times. The first time he had changed the subject. The second time he had said it was his father's ring, a memorial piece, and that he wore it privately sometimes. She said, "I should have pressed on that, Sister Gloria." I felt something when I asked, but I let him redirect me. I said, "You did nothing wrong." Then I said, "Can you tell me, the church he came from in Tennessee, do you know the name of it?" She said she thought it was Grace Tabernacle Baptist in Clarksville. She'd seen it on some paperwork he had on his desk once. I told her I would be in touch. I told her to trust me and stay close to God. That evening, I called my son-in-law, who works in insurance and does background research as part of his professional life. I told him I needed him to do me a favor and to be discreet. I gave him the name of the congregation. I gave him the initials. I gave him the date. He called me back the next morning. Raymond Elias Caldwell had been married on June 12, 2009, in Clarksville, Tennessee. His wife's name was Dorothea Ann Caldwell, née Simmons. The marriage was legal. The marriage was current. There had been no divorce filing in the state of Tennessee. There was no death certificate for Dorothea Caldwell. Dorothea Caldwell was alive, and they were still legally married. I sat with that knowledge in my kitchen on a Monday morning with my coffee growing cold, and I felt the specific grief that comes when something you hoped was a misunderstanding turns out to be exactly what it looked like. He had not lost a ring. He had removed it. He had been removing it for 3.5 years, every week before he walked into that sanctuary. He had been hiding a legal marriage while building a life in our congregation, while directing our choir, while standing at our worship services and receiving the trust of our community, while pursuing an engagement to a woman who was trusting God and trusting him and had every reason to believe what he showed her. And there was more. My son-in-law had found something else, and this time the chain had been direct. While researching the Tennessee marriage records, he had found a registered address for Dorothea Caldwell and the name of her attorney, who appeared on a spousal search filing. My son-in-law called that attorney's office directly, explained the context, and the attorney, after confirming our identity and intent, revealed that Dorothea had been searching for Raymond for over a year. Not to reconcile, but because he had taken out a financial instrument in both their names during his time in Tennessee, which had defaulted in his absence and affected her credit. She had an open case. She had documented evidence. And when her attorney learned that Raymond was in our city, under our roof, about to marry another woman while his legal wife was still searching for him, he was very clear about what that meant legally. My son-in-law also went deeper. He traced a connection to a pastor of a sister congregation in Clarksville, a man who knew the local history, and that pastor, when contacted directly and given the full context of what was happening, agreed to share what he knew. Raymond had left Grace Tabernacle under undisclosed circumstances, including allegations that he had misrepresented his marital status to a woman in that congregation during a previous near engagement that had eventually collapsed. He had left Tennessee before any formal proceeding could be completed. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a pattern. I prayed over what I knew. I called Mother Celestine. Then I called the head deacon. I had asked the head deacon, a 67-year-old retired federal marshal named Deacon Howard, who had seen things in his career that gave him an unusual capacity for gravity without panic, to arrange a private meeting with the pastor before the following Sunday. I brought what I had: the ring, the engraving, the marriage record my son-in-law had printed from public documentation, the account from Dorothea's attorney, and what the Tennessee pastor had shared. I brought Mother Celestine, who brought the date she had filed and never forgotten. I brought nothing speculative, only what was provable. The pastor sat with those materials on his desk for a long time. He is not a reactive man. He is the kind of pastor who understands that the shepherd's first job is not to move fast, but to move right. He asked careful questions. He verified what could be verified. By the end of our meeting, he said, "I need another 48 hours, and then we are going to handle this in a way that protects Portia, protects this congregation, and does not allow this man to simply move on to a third church and begin again." 48 hours. In those 48 hours, the deacons worked. They contacted Grace Tabernacle in Clarksville directly. They confirmed what we had found. And Dorothea's attorney was notified that her husband had been located. The evening before that second Sunday, Portia had been told, gently, with the pastor and Deacon Howard and me present. And I want to tell you that the way Portia James received that information is one of the most dignified things I have ever witnessed. She sat very straight. She asked 3 specific questions. She did not cry in front of us, though we all understood what was happening behind her eyes. She said, "I need to know that he will not be able to do this to someone else." That was her first concern, not herself, someone else. She had agreed to allow the Sunday service to proceed normally so that her presence would not signal anything to Raymond before the pastor was ready to address it. The service that morning was, outwardly, entirely ordinary. The choir sang. Raymond led them with his usual skill. He had put the ring in his pocket by the time warm-up ended. I watched from a distance, with the particular attention of someone who now knew exactly what she was watching. After the benediction, as the congregation began to move toward fellowship, Deacon Howard approached Raymond at the keyboard with the calm, unhurried manner of a man who has escorted people in difficult directions before. He said quietly that the pastor needed to see him in the study before he left. Raymond looked up, and in that moment, just that moment, his eyes moved across the room and found me. I do not know what he read in my face. I had worked to keep it steady, the way my grandmother taught me, composed on the outside so that your integrity has somewhere stable to live. But something in his eyes changed. A very subtle recalculation. The kind of shift that happens when a man who has been managing information realizes that the information may have been managed without him. He went with Deacon Howard. In the pastor's study, with Deacon Howard, 2 other deacons, and the documentation laid out on the desk, Raymond was confronted with what the church had found. He did not deny it immediately. He tried several responses. The separation had been complicated. They had been living apart. He had intended to finalize things. Circumstances had prevented it. Each response was met with a specific question that the deacons, with the patience of men who had prepared, answered back into silence with documented facts. Eventually, he stopped talking. The pastor told him that his position at New Covenant Fellowship was being suspended immediately, pending the resolution of his legal marriage and an accounting of the Tennessee financial matter. He told him that the congregation would be informed, not in a punitive or humiliating way, but in the way that a congregation deserves to be told the truth about people who have served in positions of trust. He told him that if he attempted to secure a position at another faith community without disclosure, the church would share what it had found with whatever institution inquired. And he told him this as well. Dorothea Caldwell had an attorney, and that attorney had been notified. Raymond Elias Caldwell left that building carrying his keyboard bag and the full weight of a life he had constructed on concealment. He did not make a scene. There was no shouting, no performance. It was, in the end, quieter than I had expected, the way real exposures often are. Not a storm, a slow, complete clearing of weather. The following Sunday, the pastor addressed the congregation. He did not speak Raymond's name from the pulpit, a decision I understood, though I had complicated feelings about it. But he acknowledged that the church had experienced a serious breach of trust involving marital identity and that appropriate legal and institutional steps were being taken. He asked the congregation's forgiveness for failures of oversight. He announced that the music minister selection process would begin again with new verification safeguards. And he asked the congregation to hold Sister Portia James in prayer, naming her specifically by her own request, not as a victim to be pitied, but as a woman of faith who had trusted God through a difficult season and who would continue to stand. The congregation did not applaud. They did something better. They were still. The kind of stillness that is full of something rather than empty of it. Mother Celestine reached across the pew and covered Portia's hand with her own. Portia looked straight ahead, her chin up, her eyes clear. That image is the one I come back to when I think about what dignity looks like in practice. There is a wedding ring in Dorothea's attorney's case file now. Or there was, until the legal proceedings concluded. Dorothea Caldwell received what she was owed. Portia James did not marry a bigamist. And New Covenant Fellowship is, as it has always been, imperfect and trying and genuinely committed to something larger than its own comfort. I have thought many times since that morning about the strange mercy of things being left in the wrong place. A ring on a ledge, an initial on the inside of a band, a date that had lived in one woman's memory for 40 years because it was the day she lost the love of her life. The Holy Spirit does not always send revelations in fire and thunder. Sometimes the revelation is a thick gold band left by a man who was interrupted for 3 minutes. Interrupted by God, I believe, before he could retrieve it and carry on with one more week of deception. Nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest. Luke 8:17. It is not a verse about punishment. It is a verse about the nature of truth, that it has its own momentum, that it moves on its own time, that it finds its way into the light not because we deserve it or because justice is always swift, but because that is simply what truth does in a universe made by a God who is himself the truth. I want to tell you something, woman to woman, sister to sister, mother to mother. Trust your instincts in the sacred spaces. That half-second pause in the corridor. The explanation that redirected instead of answering. The birthday card from the mother who was supposedly dead. Portia felt those things. She brought one of them to me. I gave her an answer that, in hindsight, was not complete enough. I should have said, when something sits wrong, don't let it sit too long. Take it to the Lord, and then take it to someone with resources to look deeper, because we owe each other that level of care. Not suspicion, but not naivety either. Discernment is a spiritual gift, and it lives in the body as much as the mind. Pay attention to what your hands do when they pick up something that doesn't belong. Pay attention to what your spirit does when it says, "This is not right." And if you are Portia in this story, if you are the one who has been carrying an explanation that didn't quite answer the question, if you are the one who let yourself be redirected when you deserved a straight answer, I want you to know that finding out the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than walking down a church aisle into a lie. Your dignity is not what happens to you. Your dignity is who you are when it happens. And the women in your community, the Glorias and the Mother Celestines, we are watching for what you need, even when you don't know you need watching for. You are not alone in the hard places. You never were. If this story moved something in you, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever found proof in a place you least expected it? A detail that didn't add up until it suddenly did? You don't have to use names. Just tell me what you saw, what you felt, and what you did, or wish you had done. Because your experience matters in this circle, and we are here to tell the truth about real things together. If this story spoke to something in you, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we are right here, holding the light steady and telling the truth with dignity. We are not going anywhere. This story is entirely fictional and created for narrative reflection and community conversation. All characters, churches, events, and situations depicted are imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is coincidental.